Okay, welcome to everybody here to the second of the, I think, enticing series of lectures, the UCL lunchtime lectures on aspects of the First World War, which actually are rarely discussed, and in this case today, hidden in more ways than one. I'm Richard Norton-Taylor, a Guardian veteran. That means I've been from a military family, actually. I've been in the Guardian for many decades and was before covering various wars, I was in Brussels for a long time, very near the Flanders fields. Of course, I'm delighted to welcome Renata Peters, who is a leader of conservation and development, a research network focused on conservation's impact in social and political arenas. She's editor-in-chief of the Journal of Conservation and Museum Studies, and runs the UCL Conversations on Conservation of Cultural Heritage blog with students and colleagues from various institutions. And with her students, she'll be investigating objects excavated from the Western Trenches. They have also worked with her on No Man's Land, an association of archaeologists and historians. And activities, which I suggest at the very beginning raises as many questions as answers. And the lecture will be streamed live with the hashtag UCL, I'll say it again, UCLLHL. And we should have 15 minutes or so at the end for questions and answers. So over to you, Renata.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Richard. Thanks everybody for being here. So as Richard said, I'm here to talk about a project in which conservation staff and students have been involved for a few years now at the Institute of Archaeology at UCL. Even if not very consistently, we're not involved in these projects every year, but we have been involved in them for quite a long time now. So this consisted in the investigative conservation of objects that were excavated from First World War trenches on the Western Front. Over 300 objects obtained from excavations were studied, documented, analyzed, and conserved by students and staff at the Institute of Archaeology. Our main input as conservators consisted in performing investigative conservation on these objects and trying to find information that would relate them to the people who used them in the past. And in some cases, information that would relate them to the people who they were associated with when they were excavated. Well, so some of this provided important information and helped the identification of some human remains, actually, but others only provided more questions. And here I'm going to discuss some of the aspects of the project. Okay, so first of all, I would like to highlight that the project had a very strong emphasis on team working. The material was excavated by No Man's Land, an association of archaeologists and historians from Western Europe and the UK, and based in the association is based here in the UK. They worked in collaboration with Yap Film Productions and at some point with the Discovery Channel as well. These acted as sponsors and coordinators of parts of the project. The film producers followed the whole process from the excavation to the work in the lab and other aspects of research, and produced a couple of documentary series with the material. The finds we worked on, like I said, were obtained from various sites on the Western Front. Most of them are quite familiar to you, probably like Loos, Passchendaele, Auchy, and others, all of them in Belgium and France. As you probably know, archaeological studies on this kind of material have not been conducted for a long time. I would say that only about 15 years now. Although there have been quite a few historic and even literary studies about these places. So in order to achieve a better understanding of the lives of the people who participated in this war and who were in the trenches, the focus nowadays is very cross-disciplinary. And here I'm going to show what we do as conservators. I should also say that when the First World War ended, because of the way that it ended, it left huge landscapes basically intact. And nowadays they're still there, a few centimeters below the surface, in I would say pretty much all of the Western Front. No man's land archaeologists aim to go there and work, like I said, so to unveil information about the people who somehow were missed by the grand narratives of history. So the people who were really fighting in the trenches. I should also say that some of these sites are endangered today, I mean, in terms of archaeology, because the archaeology is so close to the surface, and some of these sites are being highly developed or intensively farmed. So the information that they hold is in risk. And there are sometimes some rescue archaeological digs that take place in there because of that. Well, we accepted the invitation to participate. The first time we were invited to participate in these projects was in 2003, because we thought this was a great opportunity for staff and students at the Institute of Archaeology to undertake investigative conservation in a very special context, so that of the Great War, in collaboration with film producers in an educational research institution. As well, there was the intention to rebury the objects at the end of the studies or with the people they were associated with. So this removed the need for us as conservator to work on the objects and think of their long-term survival, because the intention was not to keep them, the intention was to rebury them. So despite very obvious benefits of public outreach as well, because we're going to be part of the documentary series, the project also put us in very, should say, unfamiliar contexts, right? So working with television and film producers, the kind of expectations that the different disciplines have are very different, as you can imagine. But we understood the end product, that is TV and the documentary series, as a means to get to one aim, which was to use the project as an educational tool for our students, and also to perhaps help inform the stories of the little people, the people who, like I said, were missed in the grand narratives of history. So we perceived the TV as a means to this end, and we were hoping that we could achieve some tangible benefits. But that's for you to question. I'm going to ask you at the end of my presentation whether you think we achieved that or not. I should also say that the recovery and reburial of human remains is of high importance for most societies. We could say that returning human remains to their families and naming the unnamed would help heal the wounds of the war and also bring some kind of closure to the lives that were lost in there, the millions of lives that were lost in there. But it would, of course, be a mistake to generalize and think that everybody will agree with that, because people have different values, and the way that we deal with death and the dead is very different and very personal. So we can't just assume anything about this. But in short, we were invited because of the skills that we have as conservators. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about our discipline. So as conservators, we are trained to retrieve tangible and intangible information from the material we work on. So through very simple visual examinations and then also more sophisticated instrumental analysis, we're able to unlock information from objects about, so it starts from things like, for example, how this object was made, what was the raw material, what were the manufacturing technologies, but also about the condition of that material, what happened to it during its useful life, so let's say before it was left in the ground, how it was modified, so if it's something that was produced for military use, so by looking at that we can identify whether there was any kind of personal modification in there, and what happened to it in the ground. After that, we are supposed to look at that material and try to relate this material science to the values or significance that they may have to different groups of people. That is, to the soldiers that were using them or were carrying them in their bodies or left them somewhere, or their families, or to us today. Well, after that, this is the part that this was the important part and the reason why we were included in the project. Because of course we're also trained to implement measures to make material fabric of objects last longer, to make them beautiful, to display them, make them accessible in museums. And you usually, if our work is well done, you usually don't notice that we have done something to the object. So we're quite invisible in the museum environment. But our beginning is always the material road. And by using some of these conservation skills that I talked about, we actually managed to review information about the people who used the objects we received, even if the objects were not really associated with human remains. So as you can see in the picture there, most of the objects were produced as military regalia. So uniforms, mastins, buttons. You can see even there, you can see playing cards, and if you think about the way you relate to your own things, people usually try to personalize their possessions. So we were trying to look at this material and try to find any personal information that they might bring with them. Of course, if we're looking at buttons, for example, we would inspect them for example, regiment numbers, any information, any general information they could carry with them. And hopefully some more personal information. Well, some objects didn't really give much personal information, but they collaborated in other ways. Like, for example, coins were very useful to help us date the burial, the context where they were found, or perhaps even the places where the soldier had been, As I have already said, we have always been very aware that this project delves into very sensitive areas of conservation and archaeology because it involves human remains that are very recent and still relate to us. So this never escaped our thoughts. And perhaps that was the reason as well that most of the material, even though it was military regalia, as you can see on the slide in there, parts of uniforms, weapons, utensils, because of their recent character, they were all charged with a sense of humanity, intimacy, and even fragility that sometimes was overpowering. So I'll give you some examples here. Here, for example, you see two instances of what's called trench art. So this trench art is military material that was modified still in the trenches. So this This kind of trench art is very rare, actually, because it was modified still in the trenches by the soldiers. If you look at eBay, there is a lot of trench art in there, which is not this kind of trench art I'm talking about, okay? It's completely different. So the first one in there, the first one at the top, was found near the neck of a soldier. And at first inspection, I don't know what impression you have, you can tell me later. Some people have different hypotheses as they look at those things, but it was clearly made by a soldier, and it's actually made by 3 bullets. The 3 bullets, after inspection, we found out that they were actually from 3 different armies, 3 different countries. And besides all this kind of significance that the object carries, we can also tell that the metal working skills of the person who did this were quite sophisticated. So he drilled a hole between the bullets and then intersected them and fixed them. They were very firmly together. We also found remains of leather fibers. And then so we think that it was hanging from his neck from a leather strap. The other one at the bottom is less sophisticated, but also tells small stories about what was going on in that context. So it's a shell, and then they just modified it. You can see that somebody spent a lot of time modifying it, changing the shape. I don't know for what reason. Maybe just to pass time and think about something different. And this is from the same site in Luz. So the site in Luz revealed quite a few books that survived because of the waterlogged environment where they were. Semi-waterlogged, I would have to say. You can see, well, books are usually interesting because people may have written things in them. Of course, you probably know where people bought them and things like that. In a mass grave that was found in Luz, there were, I think, 4 bodies in this mass grave. One of the soldiers was carrying 2 paper items in the area around his pockets. I should say as well that this was a mass grave, and it was obvious by the way that the bodies were laid out that somebody took a lot of time to bury them. They were buried very carefully. They were soldiers of different nationalities, and somebody really took the pains to took their time to bury them and separate them with their jackets, So you could see that it was very thoughtful work. Well, anyway, one of these bodies, who back then we knew was body 13, was carrying 2 paper items. So first we thought that this one here, at first inspection we thought that one was a passport. But after starting working on it, we actually found out that this was a Zoldbuch. So a Zoldbuch is a soldier's pay book, where obviously all his personal details will be recorded. So of course, in doing investigative work, you have to do a lot of research as you conduct, as we do. We call them micro-excavations. But you have to know what you're looking at. Otherwise, you may destroy the very evidence that you're looking for. So the work is quite slow because we also need the help of other professionals, so people from other disciplines who may help us identify, us know what we are dealing with in there. So this one, we decided that we wanted to save the first page of this pay book because that's where we thought the personal details were. Unfortunately, we couldn't see much, but you can probably, well, the light is not very good in here, but in here we could see his date of birth, though. And right below that, there was part of his father's last name. So we knew that this person had been born on the 20th of October 92. The other book was not so interesting in itself because it was a soldier's songbook. But you know, when you have a book, you receive a letter or a postcard, and sometimes you put that letter between the pages of that book. This was exactly what happened. This soldier received a postcard. You can see on the right side of the slide in there. And he put the postcard in between the pages of this book. And that's how we managed to identify him. In there we could see that the postcard was posted in Munich. We could even see the date, and it was posted to a Gefreiter Leopold Rotha. We couldn't really see the rest of his name, but we knew that already from his father's name, from the Zollburg. Well, so in collaboration with the historians we were working with, so they researched the archives in Munich, and they found out that Leopold Rothamer indeed had been born on the 20th of October 1892 in Munich. He was the son of Leopold and Emma. I think he had 4 siblings. He was a very popular guy in Munich. He was a lead violinist, a musician, a conductor. There are records of him trying to organize a choir within his regiment in the army. He went to the war in 1915 in February. In July, he was awarded the Iron Cross. In October, he was killed. In the documentation in the archives in Munich, it said that he was killed with a shot to the stomach. This is all in line with the human remains that were found. So the physical anthropologists found that actually the area in his stomach was missing. It had been exploded, basically. So you see that it's not only about who is carrying what on them, it is also about the forensic work that they do on the remains. Leopold Rothamel was buried under a name headstone in the German military cemetery at La Brie in France, along with the other unknown soldiers he was found with. Unfortunately, we could not unveil any information to help the identification of the other soldiers. We could also not find any living relatives of Leopold Rothamel. His home address in Munich, became a park after the Second World War because it was bombed during the Second World War. So his family is thought to have vanished during the Second World War. We were also able to identify Jakob Honnes and Albert Tilek from material we found that the archaeologists found in an excavation in Serre. They were also in a mass grave, so you can see some of Albert Tilek's belongings in here. He was actually identified also because of a book he was carrying, but in this case it was a bank book with his bank account details. There was a number in there, and he was identified because of the number. And there were quite a few other belongings with him. The archaeologists who excavated this were very excited because they thought Albert Tilek liked archaeology because he had some archaeological pieces with him, so probably he picked up in the trenches. We also identified Jakob Honnes. You can see him in the picture. That's Jakob Honnes. He was from the same regiment as Albert Tilek, and he was identified because of a fragment of his identity disc that he was carrying. Unfortunately, his identity disc, you can see there was only a fragment of it in there. His identity disc only had his regiment number. Okay, so that's how it was issued by the military. So we think that perhaps he was a bit anxious about dying and not being identified, because he actually, or somebody, scratched his last name in there, Hannes, and also the name of his hometown, Muchingen. And you can see it in there. Well, Jakob was a farm worker, and he was the father of 5 children. When he left for the war, his wife was pregnant with his youngest child. He never met the youngest child, but when his remains were identified, this youngest child, I can't remember what his name was. Oh, Ernest Christian Hones, was still alive, was the only child that was still alive. He was very elderly and frail, but he was reported to have said that he was delighted to know that his father had been found. And unfortunately, he couldn't really give many details about his dad because he had never met him. When Jakob Hannes and Tillich were buried in a named tomb, 14 members of Jakob Hannes' family attended the funeral. Well, so far I'm only telling you the very successful stories, right? But not everything was so successful, and not every lead really led to identification. But some of them, even if there was no identification, there were some nice stories in there. This was the case of a watch that was found in Crossroads. This was found in an area believed to have been a British trench. It was not associated with any human remains, but we decided to work on it because it was a quite nice piece. So we found out that this was an Ingersoll, so it wasn't highly popular, but it was still quite common at that time. And so we started working on this. So as you can imagine, any investigative work starts with hypothesis. So when you're looking at something, you start understanding how that was made. So we found out that that was an Ingersoll that was made, that had been made in England, and sort of find similar ones to date that material. And then we tried to do what was the most interesting part of this project, which is try to find personal signs, personal marks on the material. So, but you have to start with hypothesis. You don't know everything at once. So when, with this one, I worked on this for a couple of hours on a Sunday afternoon, and suddenly I realized that there were some words scratched or maybe embossed. I didn't really know at that point on the leather strap. So you can see the watch here, right? And then there's that leather strap behind it. This is the leather strap in here. So after working on it for a couple of hours on the microscope, you know that sometimes you start seeing things, right, under the microscope if you look at it for too long. But I was pretty sure that I could see 3 words in there. And the last of them was probably the word England. So as I emphasized in the beginning of my talk, this project had a very strong emphasis on team working. So what we would do is, as we started working on our hypothesis, we would send this information to other team members so that they could also work on that and perhaps give some information back to us, conservators. So we shared that information. I taught the archaeologists and also the film producers, right, who were coordinating this part of the project. And a few hours later, no, I told them on a Monday. I found out on a Sunday, and on the Monday, a few hours after I told them, they called me back and said that they had actually found out that a soldier named John England had died in that trench in 1914, and that actually after the war, his father had written a letter to British officers asking about his son's watch. It's a bit too good to be true, don't believe in it. Well, anyway, it was quite exciting, but a little bit scary, even if I may say, because we hadn't really proved our hypothesis yet. That was just a hypothesis we were working on, right? And so we went on with our very meticulous work in our lab, looking at things, showing it to different people and see what different people would see in there and so on. Well, a week later, the film producers contacted me and told me that they had a script ready to tell the story of John England. His name was actually John Humphrey England. They had found out his living family. They even located the letter, and they wanted to do this episode. And my reaction was a bit like, oh, really? You know, we haven't really proved the hypothesis. And it so happens that at the end, what we concluded was that the three words in there, as you probably guessed already, were just made in England. Well, a little bit disappointing, but that's all we could confirm at that point, right? But the film producers decided to go on with the episode anyway. And, well, it's television, right? So it's okay, though. They wanted to tell stories, right? And they did produce a very respectful episode telling the story of John Humphrey England, who was not the owner of this watch, or at least we couldn't prove that. We didn't have any evidence really to support that assumption. So the episode showed the whole thing, right? So our work in the lab, the research that was done, his living relatives, his photographs. By the way, he also died very young. He was also a very popular guy. He lived in Cardiff. He was a medical student. And then at the end of the episode, they had the conservators at the UCL Institute of Archaeology saying, well, actually, we don't have any evidence to support that hypothesis. So we were not very popular, I think, yeah. Well, a few months later, there was an exhibition at the National Army Museum. You can see one of our students working in the installation there. And I was introduced to one of his nephews, of John Humphrey England's nephews. And he came to me and said, "Are you Renata?" "Yes, I'm Renata. Hi, how are you?" Well, I wanted to say that I was very disappointed when I heard you said that that was not my uncle's watch. Right? Well, what can I say? We didn't have any evidence to support that hypothesis. Of course, we would like that to be true, but we didn't have the evidence. And then he changed the tone very quickly and said, "Oh, but you know what? Our family, we had almost forgotten John, and because of that investigation, we started researching his life and finding photos of his, and we actually, at the end, we celebrated his life." So, so that's the little story about John Humphrey England. In the same exhibition, I also met Walter Rapp, who was one of the grandsons of Jacob Hones, so the soldier who had the fragment of the ID. So he came to the exhibition. He was delighted. It was very rewarding for us. It's very. I'm sure you can imagine that if you work with archaeology, you don't get that kind of reward very often, right? Due to the character of the material we usually work with. Well, now moving to Oshi, another excavation, this one in 2008. This Some material was found in association. It was also a mass grave, unfortunately, also of soldiers of different nationalities. And somebody was clearly very careful and laid them very carefully. They really took their time to lay these people. And then this person who was known to us as Body 15 then had this small pouch, leather pouch, a purse, in the area of his chest. So as you can see in there, very, very decayed, really not in very good condition. The first thing we do with this kind of material, I'm sorry that you can't really see because of the light in there, you have to believe me. But the first thing that we do with this kind of material, we don't know what's inside, so we X-ray it. It's a very simple technique, right? Very accessible, that can tell you a lot of information about the material that's inside. And we saw, and again, you have to believe me in there, because I know you can't see that, some round shape. So there were some round objects inside this purse. So it could, our hypotheses were, didn't know, we couldn't look at it yet. They could be ID tags, they could be, you start thinking, medals, coins, right, or something like that. So had very strong reasons to excavate this material, micro-excavate it, so remove the layers that were on top and get to the material that was inside to see if it could help us. So as you can see in here we already removed one layer from the leather in there. It had multiple layers of leather. However, this kind of decision is not very easy to take, because in doing this kind of work, you're actually destroying the material. It's very difficult to remove this kind of material and not destroy it. So you really have to weigh the pros and cons in here. Well, but it sort of paid off, because besides an ID tag inside the purse, the ID tag actually was too deteriorated. It was very thin metal, so it had corroded completely, and we couldn't really read even the regiment number in there. It had 3 rings, had a few coins as well, and 3 rings in there. One of them, so the green one, so that's a copper alloy that was corroding. And you can see that it has an iron cross in there. After we did some research, we found out that this kind of ring, actually, it would be made in the trenches. So the soldiers in the trenches would recycle metal from shelves or whatever that they found in there, and would make this kind of rings, right? And give to the people that they thought were honorable. And also, you can see in there 2 other rings, gold rings, that look like wedding bands. What do wedding bands usually have? Yeah, so usually they have something engraved in them, right? Like names or dates or makers, marks, and things like that. And quite right, you can probably see a name engraved in there, and also this one. This was the larger one. Okay, so I'll show you here this the student who was it was Kelly Caldwell who was working on this material. So here you can see her first notes. Okay, so this is like fresh. The first time we looked at this, and she started drawing what she could see. So the larger ring had some kind of initial in it. So here. And then the name Martin, and the date 1882. The smaller one also had an initial, and also the date 1882. We didn't know much about wedding bands from this part of the world, but we thought that this was probably the date of the wedding, right? But I don't know if you noticed, there was in the first slide that I showed about this purse, the physical anthropologists, they actually thought that the soldier was probably between 25 and 30 years of age. So he couldn't have got married in 1882, so probably belonged to somebody else. And I'm sure you're starting with the hypothesis, so I'm getting you into the investigative work, right? So that's how I start talking to people, getting questions, and trying to answer those questions. To make a very long and fascinating story short, we did identify Alfred Martin, who was the son of Julius Martin and Caroline Becker. 1882 actually was the date when they got engaged, so they were from Bavaria, and in there they put the date of the engagement in there. They got married in 1883, and Alfred was born in 1884, but his mother sadly died in 1891, so when he was about 7 years old. His father marries again and had 2 more children. So from here on, what I'm going to start telling you is what we heard from, oral history. So David Kenyon, one of the archaeologists from No Man's Land, actually interviewed his grandnephew, so Alfred's grandnephew, and he told David all those things. There is documentation about that as well. We learned from him that the family, so Alfred's father, had a winery, but he suffered an accident a couple of years before the war, 2 or 3 years before the war, and he couldn't work in the winery anymore. So Alfred took over. He was controlling, he was managing the winery. The family rumors were, though, that Alfred was not very interested in business. He was more interested in girls. So the business, I'm just telling you the story the way I heard it, okay? The business, he lost the business. Then for the other generations that came after him, and then he dies in the war in 1915. And then the other generations that came after him passed on this story that, he didn't care much, or he lost the business, and he wasn't very popular in the family. However, and this is very personal, and of course we only know that because we had the fortune to meet his grandnephew. He said, well, I really have to reassess the story that were told to me by my father. Because if Alfred didn't care about the family, why did he carry his parents' wedding bands with him in his chest? I don't know. Last story. Also from Moshi. This material associated with body 16. As you can see in there, clearly spoon that is fused together with a metal box. So it's fused together with the box because of the corrosion products and also of the soil in there. So the first thing we did was to separate the 2 of them. So here's the box. We also X-rayed it. Oh, and then in this one, you really can't see anything. Well, we worked on this one just after the rings, okay? So in here, there are the repeated images of the X-ray. And in the X-ray images, we could, again, see some round objects inside the box. So naturally, I thought, oh, is this my luckiest season ever? Right? But we were quite careful about it, of course. So we thought we had reasons to believe that there was something inside the box that perhaps could lead to the identification of this soldier, who was British, by the way. But in this case, it was just very well preserved mints. It's quite interesting too, right? But I have to emphasize here that we don't, as conservators, we are trained to protect material fabric. We are trained to make them last longer, and what we were doing here, and then we're trying to extract information from it and relate that to the values of people who were using them. But so to make a decision like this, because really I had to saw this open because of the corrosion products, this was completely merged. So to make a decision like this is not easy. You really have to, you need very strong reasons to believe that this is going to reveal some sort of evidence that is going to affect the process. I hope that what I have shown you here was enough to, give you a taster of investigative conservation and how we can enhance and even maximize the work of other disciplines like history or archaeology, and how the work that we can do can actually bring information to these grand historical narratives that somehow miss the histories of the small people and the people who actually were trapped by the war and died in there. So I hope that what I showed here gave you a little bit of that sense. So the aim of revealing information from these excavated finds was very challenging and in many ways a very rewarding objective for us, So we really got a lot out of that, and so did our students. But it also required the conservation approaches to be reformulated as we worked. So there were no answers ever. We never knew what we were going to do until we were working with the material, until we got more information about that. So we really, we learned a lot from that, but we have to say that this ability to crystallize meaning in the material fabric of objects, so we're revealing information and crystallizing that information, that meaning in that object, it brings a lot of responsibilities. And like I already mentioned, opening things like that, so micro-excavating materials. So basically, we are destroying the material fabric of that object. So one of the questions that we asked ourselves all the time, really, was how far can we go, and can we really justify this kind of action, right? Is it really justifiable to destroy material so as to reveal information about people that were related to that material? Where do you draw the line? Another question, who do these objects really belong to? So who do you ask? Who should really participate in the decision-making processes? Of course, it's impossible to ask living relatives because we don't know yet who they are, right? And as well, is it justifiable to disturb these landscapes where people have been resting for so many years? So telling the story of the people who died in there, does it really justify doing that? So these are questions that I pose to you, really. Well, anyway, that's my message. And thank you very much for listening. I just wanted to, this last slide, just to show, these are just some of the people who participated in the project, okay? Just to give you an idea of how many people were involved. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to tell her now. That's really fascinating, great stuff. And as you posed questions, and maybe some you have got answers to those questions, or indeed questions. I certainly have got some. So who wants to fire ahead? There's a mic, actually, I think. Is that right? Could you speak into the mic? There's one over here. The lady here in the second row. Thanks very much.
What happened to the tin of mints?
All the material that we worked on, so depending on where it was excavated, we would follow the legislation of the place, right? So depending on where it was excavated, it would go back to the local authorities. In some cases, it was reburied in the very place where it was found. In some cases, like for example, the train chart, it actually at the end it went back to a local museum, and in most of the cases they would just be reburied. So that was reburied.
But it's that tin of meat you're asking about.
But we didn't really taste any of the mince.
Yeah, mince. I mean, how on earth? I mean, that's extraordinary how you preserve that one.
Yeah, that
Anyway,
was,
yeah.
That was a very interesting one, yeah. Too bad that it didn't really provide any information, but yeah, it was quite exciting to see how long they last.
Yeah.
My ignorance of archaeology knows no bounds, but I was interested to hear you say, talk about reburying some of these artifacts, and I had never heard that that's a archaeological practice. How do you make that decision? What's the purpose of reburying?
Of reburying. There are quite a few reasons for reburying, even if you want to preserve that. In many cases, when people can't really conserve the material they found, they will rebury it. In these cases, though, it's a different reason. It's because the material is associated with human remains, or even if it's not directly associated, it is telling the story of those people who died in those battles. So it's more an ethical motivation behind the reburial in there. When living relatives were found, it was up to the living relatives to decide what to do with the material. So, for example, in the case of Albert Martin, his grandnephew decided that, he said that the rings belonged to him and they should be reburied with him in the named grave. So there can be quite a few reasons to do that. It is common. It's not uncommon to do that.
Did you rebury human remains?
Yes. Yeah. That's there is a lot of legislation in Europe regulating that. And in France is different from Belgium. So basically, because No Man's Land is working with archaeologists in different countries, so basically they are the ones who are responsible for doing what's in line with the country's legislation.
Where you have identified bodies or remains belonging to people, have any of the families, have they all applauded what you found and pleased, or did some of them say, what are you doing, well, you shouldn't have done that? I don't know.
Not in the cases that we have worked on, no.
Yeah. No. Okay.
Which may just be a coincidence,
Yeah, there's one there, and then after, next one, yeah.
When you rebury objects rather than human remains, how do you then protect them from other people knowing that they're there and just coming along and pinching them, basically? And does that mean then that land, if it's been found in the case of sort of industrial development or further agricultural development, does that mean that ground can no longer be used because it does contain interesting artifacts?
No, it doesn't. And in many cases, it's private property as well. And so in some cases, actually, depending on the local legislation, it may belong to the landowner, actually. There is no way to protect them like that. I can tell you a story, for example, I didn't mention this here, but in one of the excavations, these excavations are very quick, I have to say. Usually they get permits to work for 3 or 4 days only. And in one of them was actually looted during the night, because this material actually has financial value. If you look at eBay, it's sort of appalling how much material is there for sale. So I'm afraid that no, usually it's reburied in the same place where it was found, unless there is reasons not to do that.
Could you put a hand up so the mic? Thanks very much. There.
My great uncle died in Fromelles in July 19th, 1916, and I'm on my way to a memorial with my family. They found his body at the Fromelles in the excavations, looking for British and Australian soldiers and trying to identify the bodies. And they identified him through DNA analysis from my family. And this work is really important, and we really value it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that.
That's good. I wonder, is there some time limit? Do you think when you will never be able to find anything ever again because of development and intensified industrial farming and so on? I mean, do you think you'll be able to professionally, as it were, go on and on and on, or will there be a point when some generation or your students or younger people will say, actually, it's not worth, or you can't look anymore?
No, there is. You saw the map, right? So the Western Front was basically from the North Sea to Switzerland. So there is a lot of material in there, and it was very active. But of course, there are quite a few agents that put this material in risk, and one of them is people. Actually, like you said, there are quite a few people who go out to look for these materials to sell it, right? So yeah, I think there is a time limit. I don't know what the time limit is, but I know that the material is in risk,
But there will be,
And it's up to us to decide what we want to do or what we can do.
Yeah.
You can't save everything for sure. Yeah.
And the question of identification, I mean, there's no percentage, or how much can you identify out of all things that you've seen, all the objects? How much have we, what percentage, can you give a percentage of how much you've actually been able to identify to an individual human, a named person, eventually a named person?
I haven't really worked that out, but I'll work on that this afternoon.
I just wondered how many. But also on the,
I would say that's a very low percentage.
Yeah.
Like I said, we worked on for the material that I presented here. It was over 300 objects. This has already been selected by the archaeologists in the field. Okay, don't send everything to us. They only send material to us that they think has potential, right? So it depends on the context. It depends, and that's why it's important that it's excavated carefully, so professionally, because it depends on the documentation that's done. It depends on what it's related to, what is near it, where it was found exactly, how deep, so there is quite a few things in there. And like I said, we didn't really identify those people only through the work that we did in the lab. There was a lot of collaboration, right? So the archaeologists from my department, from No Man's Land, historians from all over the place, watch experts, gold experts, and all sorts of people were involved in there. So I think it's a low percentage, but I really don't know.
A few more minutes. Thanks very much. More questions? Another one over there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. And can I also endorse the work that you do? My grandfather, who I knew survived the First World War, but had to live for 50 years with a piece of shrapnel very close to his spine, too close for it to be removed, and he was lucky to survive the field hospitals. But we certainly do have at least one missing relative who's never been found. And apart from obviously being able to find out where he is buried and possibly giving him a good burial, that's something to aim for. But I do think that the wider work you do in identifying the social conditions in the trenches, I mean, much of what is talked about in relation to the First World War, the carnage and everything else, largely glosses over how people made, frankly, the best of a very bad job. I once asked my grandfather what he did in the First World War when I was very, very young, about 10 years old. And he just looked at me, got up and walked out the room And my grandmother said to me, what did you say to Grandpa? And I said, I asked him about the First World War. And he said, oh, never ask him about that. He lost a lot of friends during the war.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. No, really, I think we have no idea of what happened in there, right? Because most of the work that has been done is focused on the big strategies and the big people involved in there. And
But the land belongs to whoever owns it. I mean, the private individual or the farmer. I mean, have there been opposition? Have farmers said, "Get off my land," as it were?
oh yeah, no, you have to. You need permits to work.
But have you had much
there.
opposition? Have people refused permits? Or?
Yeah, it is. You know, this part I'm not directly involved with that, but I do know that, of course, there. You know, you have to go through very lengthy procedures, right? And yes, they may just say that they don't want. It depends. Again, it depends on the local legislation as well.
Yes. Okay.
But there are, you know, if you travel in that area, there are numerous local museums or houses where people keep material that they have found. But yeah, they have all the right to say no. Yeah.
Well, that's about 2 o'clock, I think. Renata, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.